Welcome and thank you so much for tuning in to Psychology Is. As many of you know, I'm your host, Nick Fortino, and today I have with me Dr. Niklas Serning. Welcome, Dr. Niklas.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for having me. Quite excited. Been looking at some of your previous podcasts and can't believe I'm here myself now.
You are so worthy. It's an interesting origin story of this particular episode. One of our Patreon members reached out to me. This brilliant guy, his name's Kent, and he was actually also a guest on this show once. And he reached out to me and sent me your recent article, Psychodynamic Nonsense, and told me, he said it would be amazing if you could interview this guy. And I know he's probably watching now and really appreciates that this has happened. Um, so I'd love to give you a proper introduction here. I'll go ahead and just read directly from your website. I mean, obviously you put it perfectly. And so on your website, you wrote that you work with adults, children, couples, and organizations in Bristol, UK, and internationally. You're a registered existential psychotherapist, child psychotherapist, counseling psychologist, and supervisor. And you have as I said when we first logged on here, what I find to be a refreshing and inspiring perspective on what the role of a psychologist or a therapist ought to be. So, is there anything else you would like to say here before I launch into some questions by way of introduction?
No, I think that pretty much sums it up.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm a psychologist, and yeah, I guess I mean half my work is in the British Army as well. I'm an Army
Mm.
officer, so I kind of mix my time between those two. But I'm a psychologist there as well, so it's a similar job.
Somehow I didn't catch that in my research leading into this. That's
Mm.
very interesting. So, what does that entail exactly?
So, I mean, we'll get into it later about why I ended up here as a
Mm.
psychologist with these specific views. But somewhere in 2015, I figured I want to expand a little bit. So I talked to the army and asked, like, could you have, because given my past background in humanitarian work, I thought I have some information about how different cultures work, how psychology works, and I'm not trying to help the British Army understand how other cultures than our own, other cultures than our weird cultures, Western, industrialized, educated,
Weird is a
rich,
good
democratic,
not weird.
those guys, us guys, how they work. And so I spend basically half my time working with them. Yeah.
Mm. Well, let me go ahead and read the opening line of your recent article. And I'll say, too, leading into this, your whole body of work is impressive. And I look forward to diving into it more deeply. I know you have on your website a chapter that is in press entitled Trauma, the Search for a Poisoned Chalice. So some of my questions will have to do with that, but most of them have to do with your recent article published on Eon entitled Psychodynamic Nonsense. And then the subtitle is that after decades of practicing psychotherapy, you say, I believe it has little foundation in science and often causes harm. And or, your opening statement is, I'll read, the art of being for another, following, listening to, and making sense of another person's world has been practiced for millennia. Humans have always discussed their lives, their values, and their problems, trying to find meaning, solace, and joy. Experts at this sort of discussion have been called wise women, shamans, priests, and now therapists. Then, starting with Sigmund Freud, came a series of attempts to create a science of psychotherapy out of it. So I'll just ask you the open-ended question. What's the general thrust or what's the gist of this article?
Well, the attempt is here to try to not throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Mhm.
To try to be kind about the very good stuff that are you practicing clinically as well?
I'm not. I'm in education and
Okay.
research.
So, but but the stuff, the good stuff that we do, the good stuff that happens on that therapy couch, hopefully. So, but it is trying to get rid of the nonsense theories that we have and kind of go back to basics, go back to what people have done. Yes, as you said, as I said, for millennia. That connection, that exploration, but it's a free exploration, right? It's how is life working out for you, Nick, at the moment, in the past, whatever. And I'm not adding any of this because you actually are in love with your mother, or if you're cross with me, it's not because I'm a terrible therapist. You're actually cross with your dad or some stuff like that.
Mhm.
That
Yes. And
that's
then
probably where I'm
t
going with.
that makes perfect sense, and, interesting, I'll read something toward the end that you say, you reflect on the sense of responsibility and how that might have changed as your perspective as a therapist has changed, and you say that, on one hand, you feel less burdened by the
Right.
responsibility of like fixing this
Mm.
person, but perhaps more burdened or not. Yeah. That you feel a stronger sense of responsibility because you take on all of the client without obfuscating theoretical filters. What are these obfuscating theoretical filters?
Well, I remember when I started practicing, maybe 18 years ago or something like that. When I started doing full on clinical practice all the time, and I knew a lot about you. If you had come to me at that point, I would know, uh, yeah, how important your childhood was to you. I'll be looking for traumas. I'll be trying to investigate transference in that sense that what I feel or countertransference, what I feel is actually based on what you're kind of sending to me. And I would be very different in the therapy room compared to how I would be if I was meeting you as a friend. I would be much more in power. I would make many more assumptions. And the kind of liberation that I feel now that I'm out, as it were, saying, nah, I don't actually know that much in terms of what I bring to the conversation. All I bring is a really curious mind and I guess the experience of talking to other people. So I can really explore how it is for you. And maybe you are really cross with your dad and let's go there.
Mhm.
But I won't make that assumption. I want to be much more humble. And I find it just a little add on there. I find that specifically useful in supervision and working with organizations and groups where you can actually serve as a non-poison chalice, like a holder, a receptacle for whether it's a couple you're working together, you're working at larger organizations, or you're working with a supervisee, because it's quite scary to come to the external consultant and go, this is the psychology is podcast and we're having friction in our organization, right? And I can just be like, tell me more. Like, I'm really curious. I'm one of you. I'm not going to come in and go, Nick, it's all your fault. And the same thing if you come to me as a supervisee, right? It's less damning. It's less, oh, you haven't found out. You haven't found the right CBT thought process thing to deploy, but rather, how is it working for you? What is your best idea coming up? Can I perhaps offer something? That's some.
Mhm. Even though, as I said a few minutes ago, I'm not a clinician myself, I chose to go the route of higher education and research. I'm very interested in the various types of therapy, and as many people know, there's an abundance of approaches, and a couple of my favorite include the one that was really pioneered by the psychologist Carl Rogers,
Mm,
known as person-centered therapy. And then also my all-time favorite is the logotherapy pioneered by Viktor Frankl.
mm,
And some of what you're saying is reminding me, perhaps especially of the person-centered therapy,
Mm.
that there's this incredibly therapeutic value to being with someone authentically and open-mindedly without preconceived notions about them or narratives that you're kind of superimposing onto everything they share with you. And I'm not trying to put you in a box or anything like that. I'm just sharing that it's seems to resonate with a lot of the principles of person-centered therapy, which leads me to the question, if the most effective way to be a therapist is to be an authentic, compassionate, open-minded human being with great listening powers, what should education look like if not memorizing theories, to become a clinician?
I mean, you mentioned logotherapy as well, which is, yeah, so like to Frankl's famously, man's search for meaning, etc. If I were to devise a education program, it would be very pragmatic. It would be very much do the work, sit in the chair, talk to the people, learn to kind of bracket your own assumptions, know about yourself. And I don't know if that knowledge about yourself would come from you then, if you're the trainee, if that would come from you necessarily being in therapy. I'd rather have it that you explore your life and your relationships and live. Maybe have a number of different jobs and religions. I think I mentioned that in the article. Um, but it would be listening power. So I would say I am probably quite close to what Rogers is talking about. Probably that far away from often how we see person centered actually practiced in the world. Is a little bit of Jesus save us from thy followers, where humanistic has been sometimes sadly become a way of going, I'll just repeat back just what you said. And I'm not saying it's always like that.
Well, yeah.
And Lord knows these humanistic counselors are probably some of the kindest people in the world. But I do get a lot of clients coming here going, they've seen someone psychotherapist and it was bit too wishy washy.
Mhm.
But so I would have training how to sit solidly and actually be firm, querying and critical in the therapy room. But what would add to that so don't memorize the theories, but read Dostoevsky, read Tolstoy, read all the literature you can find, watch all the movies, you know, because that is the receptacle of information that we have about humanity. It is not the kind of distillation into Freud. This is what he then thinks about the world, but this is what people have actually. This is how people have had love affairs like Romeo and Juliet in different ways, shapes, and forms throughout life. So when a client comes and they are marrying outside of their status or whatever, yeah, you can draw from Shakespeare if that works for you.
Yeah, that makes sense.
More importantly, if that works for the client.
Right. That makes perfect sense, but everything you said, both the emphasis on a pragmatic education experience and, yeah, the, you know, absorbing every brilliant thing that's ever been written or said that you possibly can that is related to the human condition. I love that. Well, let me zoom in on the article a little bit more again. It was interesting. I was beginning to highlight quotes from your article that I wanted to read aloud during this conversation. And then I found myself wanting to highlight almost everything you wrote. And I'm not trying to, I don't know, like make a good impression on you or anything, but I really find that this article is packed with arguments that are all at the same time bold, disruptive, and obviously true, is my perception. And so, my general takeaway from the article is that you are really highlighting and criticizing this impulse that we have to very quickly interpret every adverse event a person experiences as traumatic,
Mhm.
to assume that every problematic behavior or painful emotion is somehow stemming from the past traumas, sometimes tracing all the way back to childhood, and perhaps that even those narratives justify our problematic behaviors. Um, and you bring in very interesting evidence, uh, such as, we had Robert Plomin as a guest on this podcast, and you referred to his book Blueprint, and all of the evidence that there is about the role of genetics in shaping who we become. And you put it really nicely. I'll try to remember exactly how you put it, and you can correct me, but you said, to summarize Plomin's work, basically, identical twins reared in very different environments are much more similar to each other than adopted siblings reared in the same household. That summarizes that work very nicely. So, have I given an accurate interpretation of the article?
Absolutely, and but it does then lead us into so a couple of things. One thing is a lot of readers that or some readers have commented on going like, "Oh, what do you mean? Do you mean the environment doesn't matter at all? What if I was, tortured as a child?" And to all of them, I say, please, no, I don't mean that environment doesn't matter. I'm just saying 50% is genetics,
Mhm.
see? And then a very small percentage is early childhood. So if you and I, Nick, we were raised in the same family, we're not genetically related, as far as I know,
Mhm.
then we would be very dissimilar. But I would be very similar to my identical genetic twin that did grow up in Sweden, where my parents were. Um, just to clarify that misconception, what I would then like to kind of use your statement as a springboard for is you can choose. So either we can talk about freedom, or we can talk about how we got here.
Mm.
Perhaps how we got here would lead into freedom. You tell me,
I
where
think
do you want?
I think that's a good idea. How we got here, leading into freedom.
So if you look at all that I know, at least all non-Western cultures, and if indeed Western culture, say maybe 500 years ago, we have quite solid cultural structures. This is how is to be an Igbo in Nigeria. This is how we do gender. This is how we do status. This is how we do redistribution. This is how we do identity. Yeah. Same thing in Japan. Same thing in China. Used to be the same thing here. And then we have this fantastic change, enlightenment, industrialism, etc. And we kind of break apart. We kill God, as Nietzsche highlighted. And when Nietzsche said that, oh, we've killed God, he didn't say that like, yes. It was a sense of, what are we going to do now? What are we going to follow? And it's interesting that just as the West kills God, or their conception of God, very quickly after comes psychotherapy. And I think there's a link there. And I think there's a link to freedom, and there's a link to causation, because it's hard to live. It's really tricky. I know from your previous podcast I've listened to that you're married and you have kids, got kids as well. They're hard work. Marriage is hard to navigate. We want to have reasons for things, right? And then both you and I are going to get old and going to have a reason for that as well, right? So if we can't blame God, if we can't find solace in God, well, perhaps if we can blame our parents or societal structures or something like that. I guess it sounds a little bit Freudian, so we kill God and we take on another father figure. But
Uh-huh.
it's to blame, so we blame dad for not having been there sufficiently, whatever. It does a couple of interesting things. Because if you blame me for a decision, so I'm 53, if you may blame me for a decision I made a year ago when I was 52, that's on me, right? I'm responsible for that. If you blame me for a decision or something that happened 53 or 52 years ago, it's not my blame. It's not my fault. So all of a sudden, I'm free and blameless. And that's quite nice. Also, the difficult decisions and the difficult relationships I have, well, if they're due to my parents messing me up with some attachment disorder or whatever, or some trauma happening because patriarchy or matriarchy or whatever it is that I choose to insert, that gives me great freedom or sense of freedom, actually. It actually
Yeah.
curtails my freedom because it
Yeah.
stops my ability to act. So I don't have
Mhm.
any traction. I can't really make a different decision if I feel that I'm stuck. And I get often my clients saying that, oh, that's my parental trauma triggers me, and I can't just have a good relationship with you. If this interview tanks, well, that's my mom, she was terrible to me. It takes away my blame, but I won't be better in the next interview. So that's how I think we got here. This is where Freud started, etc. Right? And then, of course, been a proliferation of different therapies. As you say, humanistic, existential, which I think where we could put logotherapy, the whole CBT, the logical turn, and psychodynamic. And if you want, we can go into them later and how they all work. But I want to add a final thing there, which was a shock to me. And I started practicing in kind of mid 2000s, full speed, and was quite happy to help people talk more about their feelings. And it felt like it was needed. Felt like they didn't feel their emotions enough. And I think that's valid to some degree. But when I started really questioning my profession was somewhere around 2015, when more and more people came in and they were self-diagnosing, and they had all these issues that I sometimes had to Google uh, because society told them that they were triggered or traumatized by these different. It almost became an argument where I go like, well, do you really have to be traumatized by that? Do you have a choice? I mean, that sounds like a terrible experience, but do you have a choice whether you want to? Well, you have to carry that with you all the time, and frequently they had been told that no, they didn't have a choice. The body keeps the score. And that's when I started being really worried and started getting more argumentative about it. And as you've seen in the article, I've now come out about, no, I'm not buying it anymore. Yeah.
And so much to chew on there. The first thing I have the impulse to comment on is what you said about the way in which if I can attribute my problematic behavior, my irresponsible decision, my whatever lack of integrity or something like that, if I can attribute that to something from when I was a child or some trauma that was outside my control, it is very interesting to notice how it's seemingly freeing. I'm freed from the burden of responsibility, but ultimately it's actually very curtailing to my freedom, to my capacity to direct my life. And it reminds me, one of the impactful books that I've read was The Escape from Freedom by Eric Fromm. And I feel like he talks about this a lot, that we actually do, knowingly or unknowingly escape our freedom, sidestep our freedom. And why would we ever want to do that? We all say that we value freedom above everything. And I took from his book that the reason we escape it is because with freedom comes responsibility. If I'm free to do what I want to do, if I'm free to make choices, I am therefore responsible for those choices. And that responsibility carries tremendous weight. And so, and these are inseparable concepts, freedom and responsibility. So, anyway, that's just the comment that comes to my mind here as I'm processing everything you shared.
And let's add something else to it, I actually don't know why I'm a psychologist or a captain in the British Army. And with all due respect for your self knowledge, I don't think you really know why you're a psychologist.
Mhm.
Like that guy you met in a bar that started talking about something psychology, that
Yeah.
book you accidentally found, because we're complex systems, right? There are a million different things that led us one way or another. And we try to make sense of it. And it was easier before because, or it still is easier. If you're a Hindu, karma got you here. And there is a reason, there's a logic to it. And once I realized that is all due to Gabor Mate's ideas of adverse childhood events, etc., then I can go, oh, I know, I understand why I became a shrink. It's all clear to me now. It's mom, it's dad, whatever. And I guess you could insert any other kind of explanatory model here, right? God made it so, or uh, yeah, some political theory about capitalism made it so. And I think many of these have a modicum of truth. And that's why I don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. So if someone comes to me and tells me, I am terrified of people because my ex-husband was horrible to me, or my dad was horrible to me, I'm not going to go, you're free. There are a million different reasons for why you're doing things. No, I understand. And that is valid. And let's talk about it. And also acknowledge that there are a million other things and some micro choices that you can make on the way to perhaps have a slightly better relationship with future husbands.
Yes. I love the nuance. I appreciate the nuance. Well, I'd love to focus on the idea, like Gabor Mate's work and the idea of adverse childhood experiences. You know, it doesn't take long in your psychology studies to come across the famous ACEs study.
Mm.
Um, and I want to read another, perhaps the whole paragraph, because it's all worth reading, I think. And I think listeners will appreciate it. And hopefully they'll all go read this article afterward, but I'll read the whole paragraph. So you wrote that in the few longitudinal studies that have been made, where we track children and their adverse childhood experiences from early years to adulthood, there's no link between ACEs and subsequent adult mental ill health. There's only a link between the mental ill health and the recollection of adverse childhood experiences. This may seem wildly counterintuitive to a profession steeped in trauma theory, you say. ACEs have not been shown to cause mental ill health. It is rather that when we suffer as adults, we interpret our childhoods as having been bad. I'm convinced, you say, that there are rare exceptions to this of truly horrendous childhood experiences that do leave a mark. But even that certainty falters when I consider the fact that events that supposedly traumatize one person in a group fail to traumatize others. So I'm going to reread a sentence. ACEs have not been shown to cause mental ill health. It is rather that when we suffer as adults, we interpret our childhoods as having been bad. That is very thought-provoking. Do you have any comments before I start sharing thoughts of mine about that? I'm
Yeah, yeah,
curious.
yeah, yeah. Um, so before everyone just shuts off and leaves the podcast and stuff like that, right? This this is this is contentious work. But everything well, of course I believe that, but everything that Nick said there or read is actually backed up. Um, there's it's a hilarious comment on the Eon website, and loads of comments, but there was one that highlights perhaps if we in the West believe that ACEs give trauma, well, that's then the cultural construct that we have created, and perhaps then ACEs do give trauma.
Yeah.
Like the recollection of ACEs, whether they actually gave trauma in the first place, perhaps if that is the zeitgeist, if that is the religion we live in, perhaps it's so. I don't know. I thought it was a hilarious,
Mhm.
brilliant theory. So thank you for that commenter, whose name I sadly forget. Now, we need more research, of course. There's basically no longitudinal study. What's very, very, very few. But what is scary is the certainty with which this is portrayed and kind of rolled out. That if you had a terrible childhood, if someone treated you like this gives trauma. alternatively, where people come in and they go, I feel terrible, I can't relate, or I am jumpy, I'm nervous, all these things. And the therapist starts asking, so how was your relationship? What happened as a child? Da 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 da, and try to find something, because I believe both you and I, Nick, can find something that was terrible in our childhood. I hope not for you, your case, but I'm sure there were definitely things that were really shit in mine. And so yes, I can pin current relational difficulties on that. It is possible, but note that that's retrospective. Note also that when you talk to other cultures, when you, so I've lived in many different countries for several years, and especially since I've lived in war-torn countries like Sri Lanka and Eritrea and Afghanistan, etc., East Timor, it was remarkable that they really didn't have this idea at all. Like, that was not normal to think, okay, I've been in the Tamil Tigers for 20 years, seen some nasty stuff, but now I'm a family man and I move on with my life. I This is probably when I'm less generous and I get a little bit cross. Uh, and I go, how dare the trauma counselor descend in Negombo airport, that's in Sri Lanka, and travel off to the Tamil Tiger areas and do some art therapy with the Tamil Tigers, LTTE. And can I claim that, well, they are traumatized, but they're repressing it. Yeah. You have accepted Jesus into your life, but you're not ready for it yet. It's like, there's nothing wrong with accepting Jesus into your life, but you got to do it straight. You got to do it open. And that kind of subtle, uh, it feels like colonialism. It feels like cultural colonialism to say, sorry, Nigerians, the fact that you can survive the Biafra War. Or I had someone today in my other work in the army who talked about the intergenerational trauma of Congo, of DRC. And yes, maybe, I don't know, there's no evidence for it. Probably better to work on the situation as it is right now. But bringing that in and applying that to an entire country that is totally unaware of this, totally unburdened by it, unless we introduce it, that feels really dodgy. That's where a bad psychotherapy session with maybe a woolly humanistic or a judgy psychodynamic therapist turns into, okay, now we have a international problem here. We are exporting mental ill health. There's a great book by Ethan Waters, Crazy Like Us, highly recommended, about the
Okay.
export of I think it's in the references to the article. I'm babbling on. Carry on.
No, no, you're not babbling. This is juicy. And I mean, I think you nailed it. That this is a perhaps invisible form of colonialism or mental sort of transferring of colonialism. Um, and yeah, gosh, I'm just processing everything you're saying. It's just it feels spot on. And so let me press you, even though like I said, everything seems obviously true to me. Let me just try to represent the skeptical listener here. Where do you draw the line, or how do you make sense of those those horrendous cases?
Mm,
Like, let's maybe we can work with a specific example of a woman who's assaulted, and then her sexuality is just, just definitely not liberated or active. She has a very hard time being sexual with people, and it's obviously because she was assaulted. So if you take an example like that, and then you can look at less extreme, I'm trying to kind of create a continuum here of like the most obvious examples where like that event clearly explains perhaps even years of issues. And then there's less extreme adverse events, perhaps like a woman being harassed, but not assaulted. And so could that explain issues years later? And then there's just a woman who was someone was rude to her and disrespected her. And so, I'm trying to paint this smooth continuum about the degrees of adverse events. And I'm just trying to better understand how you make sense of, like, when is it sensible to connect issues to past experiences, and how far back are you willing to look? Those are my questions.
Fiendishly difficult, so I avoid the question by asking the client. So if you are troubled in your sexuality and you had, or like the expression of your sexuality, and you were, okay, so let's take your example. And it's because you feel that every time you walk down the street, the scaffolders are whistling at you. When people are talking to you, they're not, come on, look in the eyes, move eyes up, right?
Mm.
This is a common occurrence, problematic occurrence, dodgy occurrence. And that really gets to you. That is true for many women. And that's what I will work on. So that's what you called at the kind of the light end of the continuum. For
Mm.
this specific person, this has a big effect because of the 10 million things, the 10,000 things, perhaps, that affect that of how nervous you are, how happy you are in the rest of your life, um, what other events, what your politics are, what your religion is, all that stuff. Because again, we're complex systems. And then you have someone who's been raped in a horrendous way. We have someone who's been had an icky sexual experience that is just like, that's not really what I wanted, but I wasn't terrified for my life. So if you put that on some kind of continuum, I would say that there are people at the very extreme end of the continuum, and I've talked to them that have had, the horrendous stuff, that still went like, that was absolutely horrible. And you know what? It's not with me at the moment. There are those at the light end of the spectrum that goes, it really bugs
Yep.
me. So this is what I'm trying to highlight, that of course our lives affect us. The reason why you and I are psychologists are not genetic. It's because of the 10,000 things that happen to us. And possibly overrepresented would probably be some trickiness in childhood which made us interested in why do people have psychologies? Why are we curious about it? But I don't want to say all bullied kids become psychologists. All psychologists are bullied kids. There might be an overrepresentation. People that have struggles with sexuality, yeah, they're probably an overrepresentation of people that had really bad sexual experiences or forced sexual experiences. So what I'm trying to do here is to not deny the phenomenology of this, the experience, to use a less silly term, the experience of my specific client that feels something, but it doesn't have to be big or small. And big things don't automatically have big impacts because that's how complex systems work.
And can you put your finger on what it is in a person who's capable of experiencing big things without it burdening them later in life?
I mean, the easy answer is no. I'll have a stab. Have a stab at it. It definitely increases. So, what time is it at yours? Okay, it's evening here. I'm going to go out tonight. And let's say I get beaten up tonight. Heaven forbid. But if I have good social connections, if I have a good network, if I have a good story, a good cultural story, and that's where it's dangerous to kind of the enlightenment and freedom and uh, being allowed to choose your reality can be a little bit dangerous. And a fixed culture and a religion can be quite a lot safer. I wish I had it. I don't. So if I have that, that's going to help. if I've gone through troubles before and become, I don't know if you're familiar with the term anti-fragile, something I
Yeah,
love.
me too.
So it's not that I can withstand things. It's not that I'm fragile. It's that actually when things happen, I try to learn from them. I try to get stronger. I try to realize that there's, I don't know, street violence here in Bristol, and it's something we should do something about. I get more meaning. I lean into it. I find the guy that beat me up, and I try to become friends with him and explain, understand who he is, who I am. We both grow together. I'm painting a very rosy picture of a terrible future night that I'm about to have here. But something what comes out here is the agency, the collective, and the story.
Mm,
Religions are really good at that. S- Uh, steady on cultures are really good at that. Religions and steady cultures all are also sadly really good at bigotry and groupthink and all kinds of problematic things. And I'm glad that we got rid of that in the Enlightenment. But let's also acknowledge that there were some babies that went out with the bathwater there, and we are quite atomized, and we are quite uh, not very anti-fragile. We don't get stronger through adversity. We sometimes even look for the adversity. So to go back to what we talked about earlier, in order to then feel allowed not to take responsibility for our lives.
agency, the collective, and the story. I'd love to zoom in on the story. You, in the chapter I referred to earlier, entitled again Trauma, the Search for a Poisoned Chalice,
Mm.
you say that, let me find the question exactly.
Please do, because it was quite a while ago since I wrote it. So yes, I have to
Okay,
remember
yeah.
what I came up with.
So you said my objective with this chapter is to zoom in on what happens when a client begins and ceases to see an adverse event as a trauma. So tell us, what have you learned about what happens when a client or a person ceases to see an adverse event as a trauma?
Well, they don't always do, but when they do, there is definitely a sense of freedom. There is a sense of increased responsibility, as you highlighted again, like with freedom, with power and freedom comes responsibility. I don't know if I'm projecting on them, but I imagine that there's some sense of directionlessness, that there's a loss, that's back to the kind of utility of having a story, even though it's negative.
Interesting.
Um, Marx had a not too keen on Marx, but he did have a good quote on religion being the opium of the people, and he was quite clear that it's both good and bad. To it does stop the revolution, opium, but it does
Mm,
make you feel good.
yeah.
So the idea that I'm traumatized by, so I spent a lot of time in war zones. So in Afghanistan, got quite close, and if I saw that as a trauma, it would give me great solace, but it would stop me actually moving on in life.
Yeah.
So that's my experience, and I guess the flip side, which I talk about in that chapter, I believe, or maybe some other article. The flip side is the clients that come and they really are looking for the trauma. It can be really tricky because the sometimes the trauma is not identified. It's just the behavior, right? So you and I have this podcast, it tanks, it goes terrible, I say the wrong things. I go to my therapist and go, why can't I speak? Why am I always saying these rude things on Nick's podcast that I was somehow invited to again? And I would be looking, searching for it. I'll be talking to my parents, I'll be going through old diaries, and somewhere, somehow, I will find the reason, that nugget, that culprit. Uh, And when I find clients like that, it is hard. It is hard to go, maybe it's not there. Or maybe even if it is there, how are we to know that if we do find that terrible event that you've repressed, if that even was possible, that you supposedly repressed, that it would fix it? Why would
Mhm.
it do that? Why would my knowledge that, I hope I don't get beaten up tonight. I mean, karma says I should now, but
You're attracting it.
exactly, I'm asking, but maybe if you stream this podcast and someone reads the article and they're not very happy, that could happen. I won't blame you. I'll sign the non-disclosure, that kind of
It's a good deal.
thing. But if that if that happens, that I do get punched, and then 20 years later, I am shy again, and I find up in therapy that it was actually that battering that I got. That was the reason for me now being shy. Why on earth would that make me less shy? That event that happened today will have cascaded through my relationships, through my way of being. It will be solid. The terrible example you gave with the woman that had endured terrible sexual assault, it's not just that event. It is how she then relates to men, and how men then relate to her, and how she relates to her own sexuality, and how that then cascades through all her life. 10 years later, the event, it's gone. Time is linear. It's over. What we have is a conglomeration of patterns, of neural patterns, literally neurons that connect to each other, that say sexuality is terrifying. That the event is gone. What we have now is a prediction pattern, a an assumption about the world. That, of course, is impacted by your genes and all your events and all the 10,000 things. But right now, it's just a prediction pattern.
So in a scenario like this, it's brilliant. So if you zoom in on the present moment in the way you're describing, and we can acknowledge that there's some major events along with infinite events, that countless events that contribute to these existing neural patterns. Do you find that there's really not much value to re-experiencing, remembering, processing, going through the traumatic event? Do you find that that is unproductive and even harmful?
Never understood really what processing and working through means.
Mm.
Perhaps that's that's the reason for the article, and I should just go back and learn how to do that. I Because we don't really process memories. We don't really go through them. That is almost like saying, I'm going to watch Die Hard 1 again, or Rambo, or whatever movie you want, Top Gun. And you can go through that. That's not how memory works. Like, for all the listeners out there, please try to remember your father's nose. I can't. That's how bad my memory is. I cannot see his nose in front of me. I will recognize, not remember him. If I had someone very similar to my dad and my dad next to each other, that's my dad. Close my eyes, I can't see him. Nick, with all due respect, if I look away from you, I can't really remember exactly. Well, I think it was a short sleep. Yes, it was. But our memories are recreating. Yeah, we're creating a memory right now based on the information we have. It's not a perfect recreating of what happened. So working through something that happened 10 years ago, you're not working through it. You're not remembering. So should we then throw the baby out with the bathwater? No, because having a light story of how did I get here? Why am I so scared of having sex? Well, yes, we must understand the narrative arc. Yeah, it probably started there. And it might also have been influenced by my Catholic upbringing or whatever it was. And then it cascaded through like this. I get it. I understand. I can kind of have some sense of closure of an understanding of something. I mean, Freud famously said that like doesn't have to be true, the analysis of the client, but it is a story. So, I would definitely spend a few sessions trying to make sense of the past. But then it's about, okay, we have arrived. This is the situation. You find it hard to have sex with people, and you're here because you want to. It's not like you just let go of it. That would actually make life easy. But you also want to explore this part of yourself. Okay, so what other stories can we create? That is the origin story, but what other stories can we create now? What different ways of living can we work with? Or should we accept that, you know what? It's not worth it. Let's just let go of that part of your life and try to build a rich life over here. Uh, there are a million different ways that we can do this, and I would client leads as always. But I really do not believe, and that's true also for my military clients, officers, and soldiers that I work with. It's like, yeah, we go through what happened in the contact with the enemy in that specific area. Um, but then we move on to, okay, so how are you living now? And 99 times out of 100, and because there are exceptions, I have had, but it literally is 1 out of 100 where there are the intense flashbacks and it just really is there.
Mhm.
99 times out of 100, we're talking about how boring life is here. So back to the military, boring life is here in Civvy Street compared to the cool stuff, the alley stuff back there. Uh, I've gone off course.
No,
Took me back.
I'm tracking, and everything you said about memory too is very important, and I think we actually had, Elizabeth Loftus as a guest on this podcast, and so some people and some listeners might be familiar with her work. She's definitely produced a lot of evidence that backs up everything that you're saying, and, both a few things come to my mind. This came to my mind when we were talking about the adverse childhood experiences as well, that memory is largely mood dependent. Much of cognition is largely mood dependent. The way you're interpreting your experiences, the thoughts you're thinking, the images that are appearing in your mind, the memories that are surfacing are often congruent with your mood. And so it makes sense that if you are extremely depressed, that congruent memories, right? Depression congruent memories are going to most likely be readily accessible. And that makes me think that there's so much data of our whole lives. If we think of every moment we've ever lived, our entire timeline as a massive amount of data, I think it's quite possible to interpret that data in a way that explains why I'm flourishing, or to interpret that same data in a way that explains why I'm floundering, why I'm depressed. Um, there's just so much we can cherry pick, and even just full narratives, for full storylines that are supported from events that happened in every chapter of our lives that can justify every possible outcome. So, and then what you said too about the recreation of past events, that's I just want to emphasize that. And when people if you we all really think about the word remember and think of it as kind of the opposite of dismember. If to dismember something is to take it apart, to remember it is to put it back together. And that putting back together process is not 100% accurate with our memory. And again, there's just very strong evidence that imagination sneaks its way into memory sometimes, that our mood or current information that we're exposed to can distort the accuracy of memory. So I like your approach. Again, it's very nuanced. You're not throwing any babies out with the bathwater, but you're highlighting that it's important to acknowledge things, and yet there's probably not value in trying to rewatch that movie over and over again, because it's not even necessarily an accurate reflection of the facts of what happened. It's upsetting. Perhaps it's even reinforcing existing neural patterns. And so we're not denying it, we're acknowledging it, but we're not necessarily interfering with the present moment
So,
by trying to press play
but
on that.
to take something from what you said there, like how we can, based on our current mood, how we then see reality. Isn't it interesting if you look at all the different versions of Islam and Christianity, how the same book, or those two same books, can breed such fantastically the most loving, gentle Christians and the most bigoted. You you pick, same thing in Islam. Pick the right surah, pick something from the Medina version, which is made more aggressive, or the more shanty, chilled out Mecca version, and you do the same thing with Old Testament and the New Testament, and you build your thing, which means that we should, I don't know, stone all the gays or say that love is love. We get the same thing. And I guess, therefore, you and I, as we move forward in our day today, have to pick carefully. I can choose the times that I stumbled in this interview and go, oh, such an idiot. Or I can choose the ones that the few times, very few times, that I nailed it and go, yes. And I can take the ones where I stumbled and I can go, let's get better at that, but let's not put all of me down and let's do those things again. So, because I choose judiciously and I take responsibility for my life and this interview and my memories, so-called memories.
Mm. In the bit of time we have left, I would love to talk a bit about therapy for children.
Mm.
I think your comments on this topic are extremely important for the world to hear. So please just elucidate for us what are the common practices regarding providing therapy for children, and what do you see to be the problems with these common practices?
So there's some really good practice out there. Um, Interestingly enough, often in the kind of state paid, what people often see as like industrial therapy for children. So we call it CAMS here in Britain, but very kind of like, okay, you're a 10-year-old child and you're really struggling. Uh, Here are some tools: square breathing. Try to get on with life. Right. So there are some good family based also where you take the whole system into account. There's some good examples out there. But also in the probably more in the therapy culture space. This is kind of therapy adjacent,
Mhm.
where you have kind of the schools that try to do trauma and attachment based support for kids. Then it can get really really problematic, where you have that sense that, oh, it was an ace that created it. The reason you're kicking off is because poor attachment or something like that. Which means that you don't get that. We talked about a cultural scaffold before, of like, this is how it is. This is how it is to be a kid, which is painful sometimes. You come up against that scaffold and you bash your head against it. But it does, after a while, kind of make the school work. What we instead do is, well, Niklas, you're kicking off. You're biting the teacher. It's because your relationship to your mom. So let's take you out and play some football instead. I know it's kind. I know it's loving. But it actually stops me, as a 10-year-old biting the teacher, from learning. In awareness or outside of awareness, I'm learning that kicking off actually allows me to kick football. And I like that much more than maths. So you have that problem. Furthermore, you also have the problem of private practice. And, I'm one. I'm not anymore. I don't do it anymore. But where you go and you talk to this little kid of 10 years old, how you feel? Let's really deepen into that feeling. What's going on for you? The sand tray and everything. And again, let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater. It does make sense to understand, how do you see your family? How do you see mom's new husband? And how does it all work out? Okay, fine. Now we get it. You have a picture. Now, how are we going to crack on and make your life okay? How are we going to make it function? What do you actually need in order to function? Because some kids do need extra support, and that's absolutely valid. But it shouldn't be the first knee jerk reaction where we go, Nick, you can't handle it. You're going to have special measures, and we're going to create the world around you. If we do that, we're going to create a world around you that we probably can't afford to keep up. And we're going to chuck you out into society, and you don't know how to behave with the other kids.
Good point.
So, with all the love in the world and all the kindness in the world, I do think that we need to gently scaffold our kids to learn to deal with adversity, to learn to adapt. We do this in as mindful way as possible. We do it by not necessarily deepening into every feeling and say that every action is a subtle communication of distress. Some kids, including myself, including my 2 kids, they're listening. Sometimes we just do it because we want to do it. It's not an expression of distress. And
Mhm.
even if it was an expression of distress, totally accepting it might not make us happier in the long
Mm. Yes. It's interesting. I'd like to share a reflection as a father. Um, I have 2 kids and, such a great relationship with both of them, and my son's 11 at this moment, and um, being his father has like been the greatest joy of my life and one of the hardest things I've ever done, for sure. To be a parent has been the hardest thing I've ever done. And remember there was a phase, where he's just a very intense child and his emotions are strong in every direction. So he's like the funnest kid to party with because his excitement and joy level knows no bounds. But when those emotions are anger or frustration, that's also strong. And I remember there was a phase where I was really trying to like get to the deeper level and understand it and have him explain it to me why he's reacting in that way. And there was a period where I was really struggling and I was kind of desperate for wisdom. And then, who knows what led to me having this kind of epiphany, but it felt like an epiphany. And the epiphany was simply in those moments, I just need to cheer him up. That was it. That was the epiphany. And I swear it really shifted things in a extremely positive way. It simplified everything so that I stopped being so anxious. I stopped thinking, "Oh no, is this child going to be an adult who can't control his emotions?" I stopped running with narratives that made me less capable of handling those moments, and I simplified it down and and like you pointed out, like, you don't always have to take emotions, like, so seriously, like the whole idea of them being my truth and my reality and something that just really needs to be explored and understood and dwelled in. I shifted away from that, simplified it down to this is a kid who's upset about something. And what needs to happen right now is I need to use my psychology skills, not to analyze him, but just to cheer him up. And that has made a huge difference. I've committed to that and it's been extremely positive.
So you made judicious use of all that was your son, and you chose to find that little part that was joyous, that was cheerful. A bit like we do in the Bible, a bit like you and I are going to do after this injury, where we pick out, okay, well, life's okay.
Mm.
Notably, it probably, well, hopefully never, but there could well be a time where actually he was so devastated that you couldn't cheer him up because actually something really bad had happened. And that allows you then to go, okay, let's not throw that baby out with the bathwater. Look, okay, look, so something actually happened here. What's going on? How
Yeah.
do you feel about your brother or your sister, school or whatever? And, maybe there is a real problem.
Mm.
So we don't do it always, but we try to go, look, kiddo, I know you're devastated, but dinner's on. Come on,
Mm.
let's go have dinner.
Mm.
Because that will move you on. Just like we probably should tell ourselves when we're devastated. Because feelings are very bad approximations of reality. They are this strange kind of, you have loads of information coming in and your feeling is the resultant of all that information. Imagine if you're a squirrel and there's a sexy squirrel over there and there's a acorn over there and there's an owl up there, and the resultant of all
Mm.
these different inputs are go for the acorn or hide in the bushes or something like that. It's valid, it's good information, but if we are able to rationally think about it, we probably should use that. And kind of the Buddhists are quite good at that. They're talking about feelings and the feelings, thoughts and the thoughts, as they go on, body, etc. But the idea that don't necessarily let these things create a positive feedback loop with each other, where I feel bad, so I think bad thoughts, so I feel even worse, so I pick even worse memories to, and there I go, kind of cascade down in mood. But instead, I feel bad, I examine the thing and go, actually, that I think that's not really valid, and I'll try to move on. It's not going to be easy, but I try. At least I don't cascade as much.
Yes. I love what you said. I love the way you think. It's just the nuance is so rich, and I appreciate it. And yeah, you make a good point, and I'm glad I can clarify that. I definitely can imagine a swing of that pendulum way too far in the other direction regarding like how I responded to my son's emotions, to where I'm just always simply trying to cheer him up, even when there is a real issue that needs to be discussed. And so I don't, fortunately, I don't think I've gone to the opposite extreme, but there's two extremes here. One in which you never analyze, and the other in which you always analyze. One in which you never allow space for the feeling, and the other in which you always bring it in. Like you kind of cause it to last longer than it was going to by exploring it.
Yeah.
Um, so
That's how EMDR works, that it kind of
mm,
allows the feeling to just kind of, okay, there's a feeling here, let's let it die out. Remember that all this stuff was like Freud, that was repressed Vienna. It's a bit like, those 50s movies we see when they're like, hello, everyone's really happy. It's like, well, if you apply it to that, yes, come on. You're not always happy. You're
right,
always cracking on with
right,
things.
right.
Sometimes things are sad. And that's, we go there. But to apply it today, to apply the recommendations of deeply repressed Victorian Vienna, where Freud was, or those 50s movies, to a world that is highly emotionally attuned, that is learning new diagnoses on TikTok every day.
Yeah. Maybe my final question here, if you've got time for it. As you may have picked up on by watching other episodes of this podcast, we have focused significantly on criticisms of modern psychiatry and the very quick impulse to diagnose people or to self-diagnose, and then of course the equally quick impulse for many psychiatrists, especially in the US, to prescribe drugs in light of that. And so I would just love to hear any thoughts you have about the implications of this trend.
Well, first to say, to like, in defense of psychiatry, that, on a bell curve over here, you do have people where medication is fantastically needed. Life is so shit. Your freedom is so low. Uh, and, it's terrible. So, yeah, sedate, you know, take down the pain. So, yeah, so to give, let's not throw that baby out.
Mhm.
Um, this part, where, I mean, antipsychotics and antidepressants are basically they're like dry martinis on steroids, right? They are dulling drugs. They take it down, and then they have loads of interactions with each other. I mean, you had a previous person on the podcast that explained it 10 times better. I think it's an extreme version of what I'm complaining about. I think so. If therapy culture has created a kind of a hydraulic, mechanized, linear view on the human mind, where if you repress your sexuality, your aggression goes up, and we need to find that thing, and then we'll cure it. A bit like, yeah, a bit like science, which we haven't really arrived at a science of psychotherapy or psychiatry yet. Um, then the hard end of all that comes into psychiatry, where we are diagnosing these dulling drugs. They don't really know what they're doing, bless them. But and there are many good examples of psychiatry, but yeah, I think that's where you see the hard end of what I'm complaining about.
It's a great,
That answers your questions.
great. Oh yeah, great answer. Makes perfect sense, and I agree. Nicholas, I think this is the 74th episode of this podcast, and I think it has become instantly one of my favorites. This has been
You're very kind.
absolutely. I mean it. I just I respect you and your mind and the way you think, and I've enjoyed this conversation tremendously. I look forward to listening to it back, and I trust that we'll stay in touch. I'm glad we're connected.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you for all your kind words. I'm not very good with compliments, so I just go that. Due to my childhood, you see.
Right, of course.
I have no freedom in there. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you. Thank you to the listeners. Where can listeners find you if they wanted to track your work?
Well, so shameless self-promotion.
Yes.
This is the the book about, but this is about the military work, but it's about influencing conflict. So it's interesting if you working in an organization where there is kind of struggle.
What was the title of it
Um,
again? Just in case
sorry,
some people
yes.
only get the audio.
So the art of influence in conflict. But all of this book, and also a forthcoming book about. So the article that we're speaking about today is being turned. I spoke today to my agent, so we're going to turn that into a book. So that will be available as quick as I can write, and but all of this will be available at my website, which is conveniently at serning.com. So my last name.com. So there's some other articles there. There's an upcoming book, and there's a current book, and yeah,
Awesome. Let's have you back on when the book gets published, maybe. I can't wait to read it.
that would be lovely. Thank you.